Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, March 17, 2026, and our dear friend John Helmer is here with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Good to be back.
John, let me start with the rumors around Benjamin Netanyahu. And it seems that recently he's not participating in the security
Mm.
briefings in Israel. And then we
Yes,
had 2 or 3 videos of him, and mostly people are talking about these are AI generated
yes.
videos, they're not real. What is your understanding of the situation around Benjamin Netanyahu?
It's very important. Speaking from a Russian point of view, when an individual like Mikhail Gorbachev is subject to detention, to arrest, and there's a putsch going on in the capital, the first thing you do uh, is to make sure that he's still alive. And you do that by telephone, among other things. That was a long time ago when the putsch was attempted against Gorbachev, to verify that he was alive and talking first. Second, with respect to Netanyahu, there have been 3 video clips he intended to show he's alive. The first was the so-called six-finger video, where he makes a speech, and the AI analysis shows that there are all sorts of manipulations. That because that failed to be convincing, either that he was alive or in command, and we'll come back to the difference between those 2 things in a minute, because they're strategically significant. He did the coffee cup video. The coffee cup and coffee shop video has been analyzed. I've seen it. Lots of millions of people have now seen it. You've seen it. It shows several AI fabrications. And speaking from a Russian point of view, we're used to fabrications. Yeltsin's speeches were often fabricated with cuts. You could see the cuts. And in this particular case, you can see cuts. First, when he drinks from the coffee cup, you see that he doesn't swallow. You can't drink coffee and not swallow it. And you see a cut in the clip between the moment he sips and the moment he swallows. It's a fabrication. Second, as many people have seen, the surface of the coffee and the design of the cappuccino don't change even after he's begun drinking from it. That's the second one, and it's suspect. The third one is, let's call it the girly video. That's where he goes to a site and begins talking to girls, to several women. You see a couple of bodyguards around him and so forth. Again, the object is to show he's alive. However, if you look carefully, you see he's wearing the very same jacket as he wore in the coffee shop video, which was screened a day before, more than 24 hours before. If you look at it very exactly.
John, do you
Yes.
want me to play it for you?
I don't know. I think everybody's sick of them. And I want to come to a bigger point. What you can see is the zipper on his jacket is in the same position as it was in the coffee shop a day later. Not possible. It's not normal. Now, what do these things show you? It may show you he's still alive. It definitely shows you that Netanyahu wants to show the world that he's alive. But what it doesn't show you, and that's the point you began with, he is no longer in command of Israel. Prime ministers don't show that they're in command of a war, let alone an economy. The normal prime ministerial operations, he's not showing. Why do you show a coffee cup and 2 girls when you are really in command? Now, what does it mean if he's alive but not in command? This is a very interesting problem, and the Israel and Netanyahu's videos, whether they're AI fakes or not, show he's not in command. Therefore, the question arises, has there been or is there ongoing a form of putsch in Israel? This is a very serious development. And I can't add from what my Russian sources say because they're not those who know aren't talking, and there's more suspicion and guesswork than there's reality. But let's step back a minute and look at the strategic issue. Why would there be a putsch now against Netanyahu? Or why would he be afraid of one, and aims to show at this point he's walking around freely and therefore in command when he's not? Answer. In many respects, as your colleagues, my colleagues show, Israel is now defenseless, as Ted Postel explained on your program last week. It's unable to achieve its principal war aim against Iran. Let's say it's genocidal against Iran, but it also, in military terms, means that Israel's principal war aim is to prevent Iran ever having not only nuclear warheads, but conventional warheads on ballistic missiles with the precision that can destroy Israel. Ted Postel's data really convinced me and should convince us all, without exaggeration. Iran's retaliatory capacity, something we've been talking about for months, is surviving. It survives to the extent that Israel loses its war aim. The US is different, and I disagree with those who think that Israel is Trump running this war. It's always the other way around, but it suits many administrations for election purposes and other purposes to make it appear that Israel comes first. And it's reasonable for Iranian foreign minister and others to deride the US policy as Israel first. But now what we have is a serious turning point in which the US is facing a longer war than it anticipated. Israel is facing a war that cannot end the existential threat that it faces from Iran. And in fact, it now faces a stronger threat than Israel has ever faced before. What's to do? Answer, we've talked about before. I've written about in Dances with Bears, and others are seeing it too. Israel will reach for tactical nuclear weapons if they run out of all other alternatives. And what we know from the way he behaves, the way he thinks, the way he speaks, Netanyahu is an advocate of tactical nuclear warfare against Iran. The question is the United States, is the Trump administration, are the Israel firsters around Trump, the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA and the so-called deep state, are they all in consensus on whether the US wants Israel to use tactical nuclear weapons? I'd say, on balance, the US does not want Israel to try that and is now looking for ways, first, to shorten the war. Let me add a few points about the time there, and that there's not much time. Let's just go to the question of time, if you don't mind, and stop me if I'm wandering away from your question. We know from two bits of evidence, the Americans want this war to be over in approximately 2 weeks. Why do we know? Because Trump told Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, to work out yesterday in Paris with the Chinese that he will not be coming to Beijing for a really important summit meeting, March 31st, April 3, because he has to stay home to run the war. This wasn't what the Chinese accepted he would do a few days ago. Remember, last week we talked about the foreign minister of China, Wang Yi, endorsing Trump to show up on March 31st in the middle of a war. We thought that it's disadvantageous, to say the least, from a PR point of view for the Chinese, to be welcoming a war maker at that time. But it's Trump who wants to be in Washington on March 31st. So that's 2 weeks away. from today, he thinks he might be needed in Washington to run the war. No, it's to run the negotiations to end the war with a bigger group of advisors than can be fitted into a plane on the way to China or can be securely involved in discussions if Trump is in China. Second, Scott Bessent, in yesterday's interview after meeting with He Lifeng and Li Chenggang, the two Chinese negotiators, gave a very interesting press conference. First, to explain basically that the Chinese and the Americans failed to reach any significant tariff agreements in Paris that they could put on to President Xi and President Trump to agree on in a summit. That's one issue. Second, Bessent, and I'm looking down at my paper to get the text right, Bessent was asked, how much oil is there in supply? How quickly are you prepared to give sanctions waivers to the Russians? What do you see the timing of the oil supply to be? Now, Bessent, it's worth understanding, said some of the obvious arithmetic. 20 million barrels of oil come out of the Hormuz, nothing comes out. A small amount can be diverted by the Saudis to Yanbu and come out the Red Sea. That's if the Gerald Ford can protect the Red Sea, and that's if the Houthis don't begin to close Bab el-Mandab, which they may do if Iran and the Houthis agree on that point. So what Bessent says is, and I'm reading, it looks like the deficit is about 10 or 14 million barrels a day, he means, and that's before any of the ships are coming out of the straits. Then if you think about the Russian oil, he's talking about the floating Russian oil in tanker storage offshore India, offshore China, offshore many places. That's been given a waiver to sell and unload until April 12. That's, said Bessent, between 9 to 11 days to 12 days of supply without the market moving. Then he talks about the additional strategic reserves. What he's talking about, what he's pressed to answer is, how much oil do you think can be supplied to the market before there's a strategic disruption? And therefore, how long can you put up with, can the world put up with the closure of the Hormuz Strait? The assumption there for everybody is that Trump's notion of opening the Hormuz Strait against Iran has failed. It has failed before it started, and it fails without mines. Iran has become the gatekeeper of world global oil supply. This is really important. Gatekeeper, folks. That's the phrase, a word to remember. So Bessent is telling the world, we think we've got about 14 more days of surplus at sea. Beyond that, he knows Russia can produce about 500,000 more barrels a day into the market. A certain amount can come out of Venezuela. But from what Bessent says, he thinks the oil shortage will last only for another 2 weeks. That means he thinks the US will be able to negotiate with Iran terms of end of war, which will reopen Hormuz, which means, to corroborate Trump's travel plan, the Americans think the war will last another 2 weeks. Now, let's suppose that's right. Nobody has to believe me. That's what they say. Let's suppose they're right. If they're right, we now have 2 weeks in which the Americans are looking to negotiate out in order that Hormuz opens. On the other hand, the Israelis want to destroy Iran within 2 weeks, and it can't be done without, they think, without nuclear weapons. So who is pushing against the American idea of reopening Hormuz, ending the war by March 31st or thereabouts? Answer, who's pushing against the Americans? It's Netanyahu. Netanyahu. What do the Americans think then? I believe it's reasonable for our audience, for you, for the Iranian side, and for everybody else to figure that Netanyahu makes a very convenient scapegoat for an American negotiated end of war. Why? First of all, he is already the leader of the Israel war faction, and many Jewish communities who oppose the war but remain Jewish want to say that Netanyahu is the rotten apple in the barrel. Let's leave aside that we don't agree with that. That's what they say. We also can pick up, I'm reaching for it, Ayatollah Mojtaba Khamenei's speech. And there are three main points that are, let's call it, end of war terms. One is revenge for Khamenei's death. Well, that point could be met by the removal of Netanyahu, dead or alive, but finished. It's one possibility. Removing Netanyahu would change the Iranian perception. It would change the world's perception. Who could remove him? Only the Israeli military. Only the Israeli military. It would be a military putsch. There has been such a precedent between Pakistan and India when Pakistan was reaching for its nuclear weapons last April. During the Operation Sindoor, which Pakistan lost to India when the war began between the two, Pakistan reached for their nuclears. When India detected that, they multiplied massive air and missile attack, destroying Pakistan's command control, making Pakistan as defenseless as Israel now is. At that point, the Pakistani military, who run the country, telephoned Vice President J.D. Vance and said, we want a ceasefire. That's how the war ended. And the Indian officers who've described what happened, described the relative rationality that they shared with the Pakistani military to avoid the nuclear escalation step. It's happened before, it could happen again, and it meets the Ayatollah's first point. The second point in the Ayatollah's end of war terms is that Iran must have reparations from the enemy, and if the reparations are refused, the Iranian side will destroy the Arabs' property as well as the US bases to an equal value. Plus, there are Iranian reserves, bank reserves, stolen by the English. They're all over the place, and they could be restored. So there is a way of meeting the reparations term. And finally, and this is a crucial difference between Israel and the United States, the Ayatollah said the US bases must be closed immediately. Now, the Iranian side, we know, and your colleagues have done a terrific job of acquainting us with how much destruction, beginning with the losses of the big AN radars in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, if I'm not mistaken, and Jordan, on which all of Israel and US air defense depends. The US could withdraw from the bases and not reconstruct them, at least for a foreseeable future. They don't, in fact, need them. Why don't they need them? For the US can walk away with the idea that it has brought Pakistan and India into a US strategic embrace, and we can come back to where India is in this war, but it's certainly not with Iran. It's against Iran. if the US calculates that its principal enemy is China, and it cannot cope with the unpredictability of tactical nuclear warfare against Iran, which would cause a dead hand retaliation. Israel would be destroyed by the dead hand, automatic retaliation. If the US side decides that at the military level, the CIA level, then it can cope with a loss of bases because it will gain strategic combination against Iran in the West, Afghanistan in the West, and against China in the East. So I can see, and I think we should be anticipating now, that the US can walk away not with Trump's win-win total obliteration of Iran, but win, not win-win, and not obliteration, but without the obliteration of Israel. So that's a theory. It's potentially wrong. However, I'm working from the basis that the US needs and wants a short war and has to come to negotiation with the Iranian side on the Ayatollah's terms, not on Witkoff and Kushner's.
John, you mentioned the Strait of Hormuz. I think one of the main questions, one of the main difficulties that the Trump administration is facing right now is the Strait of Hormuz. How did you find the reactions of the NATO countries? Donald Trump said that NATO without the United States is nothing. Then he comes out and somehow begging them to help him in the Strait of Hormuz. Who are these NATO countries, and how did you find the reaction to Donald Trump's, request?
Well, I think the important point, and you implied it, and our audience understands it, is the Europeans broke into pieces. They see things differently. We know from the reporting, it's a bit less than clear, however, that the French and the Italians have tried to negotiate directly with Iran for exit from Hormuz. Again, this is such a war winner. Iran is now the gatekeeper of the Persian Gulf. Not since Darius, 2,500 years ago, has Iran been so powerful despite its weakness. This is insufferable to the Jewish, Zionist, Israeli war plan, but there it is. So Europe acknowledges Iran as the gatekeeper and tries to negotiate exit. We've seen India, which declared war on Iran in the Knesset when Prime Minister Modi screamed, "Am Yisrael Chai," 48 hours before he knew the war would start. There is a lot we can say that indicates that there are military objections in India to Modi's behavior. And meantime, we can see that Foreign Minister Jaishankar has been busy going to Europe, pleading an Indian role to mediate a settlement between the Europeans and Iranians, as if Iran needs India as an intermediary. So we know that the French and the Italians took the view, we'll negotiate with the gatekeeper. We don't any longer believe the castle can be destroyed. We will go up to the gate and negotiate with the gatekeeper. That's one thing. Merz, the German, the mini chancellor, and Starmer, the mini government leader of the UK, have taken a different line. They're principally concerned with fighting on the war in the Ukraine against Russia. They see their principal enemy to be Russia. They don't want a war that goes on and on, that gives Russia more and more economic leverage through energy supply. So it's unclear to me what, in fact, Merz's policy is towards Iran. But I don't see that he's at all confident of anything with respect to Iran. We've seen the Belgian Prime Minister announce Europe must normalize its relations with Russia because of the current war. So we have a breakup of the NATO countries, reflecting rather well their sensitivity, their political sensitivity, and their political weakness if energy prices shoot up. And basically, Trump's is as sensitive as they are. They are no more sensitive than the US president is. So I think what we can see now happening is a total failure on the part of the Europeans to offer any form of joining the war. They don't want to join the war. The most Starmer can do is plus the French, plus a few Spanish weapons, plus the Greek Navy, plus the Cyprus Navy. They can throw a few things into the defense of the British sovereign base at Akrotiri in Cyprus after 2 hits on the Akrotiri base in Cyprus. This is for show. They all combined and failed, as you know very well, at opening the Red Sea against the Houthis. And the Houthis took terrible punishment during that episode, but they won, establishing themselves as the gatekeeper of Bab el-Mandeb, right? They did. But compared to them, the Iranian achievement's even greater. And I think the answer to your question is NATO and the United States are in the same boat. And that boat is either locked into the Persian Gulf, where it's a sitting duck, or it's locked out where it can't open the energy spigot. And that energy spigot must open, according to Besant, for the market to normalize after 2 weeks.
John, what was amazing to me that the transformation of the German chancellor, you remember during 12-day war, he said that Israel is doing our daily job. Then when this war was about to start, he said that the regime changed. The so-called regime must change in Iran. And then, after Donald Trump asking them to join him in the Strait of Hormuz, he came out, said something totally different from what we've heard from him so far. He says the war in the Strait of Hormuz is not a NATO war, and
Yes.
we're not going to join you. And how could you explain this sort of transformation once he said that this is the best move on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu? Right now, he's just ignoring what Donald Trump is asking for.
It's plain politics. You've got a good German correspondent. I'm sure he can explain that Merz is the chancellor with a 28% mandate at the last election. You've seen comments from the AfD opposition that the German economic condition is catastrophic, and that means politically for Merz, he can lose power so he has to stay out of a war that's being lost. First of all, I think we have to emphasize that all of them, Trump, Modi, even possibly Xi, but certainly the Europeans, and Merz, as you quoted him, believed that the attack would win the war within 3 or 4 days. You'd have regime decapitation, you would have the total destruction of air defense, you would have a defenseless Iran, and you would have the total loss of their retaliatory capability. They believed that could be done, or they were told that could be done. They discussed that could be done within 3 to 5 days. They have failed. Therefore, they have to switch. And I think that explains Germany, British politics, French politics, all the weak political states. But let's not forget, Trump has the disapproval rating is edging upwards, not by much, but by margins, half a percentage point each day or two. That's not how a war-winning president can expect the public opinion polls of his country, the United States, to be, but it is the way it is. Why? Because the polls show, I looked them up just before we came on, the polls show that though there is a relatively small, roughly 3.5% gap between disapproval of Trump's war against Iran and approval, that's hinging on the rising disapproval of Trump's inflation policy. So when you correlate votes with tweets, what you see Trump trying to say is, folks, it's short term. Yes, we'll have an increased price on the gas pump now, but by the time May starts, by the time the driving season starts, it'll all be over. Well, he has to deliver that now. Why? Because the voters tell him that. The White House technicians tell him if you don't, you'll lose worse and worse each day. Now, each of them are in that boat. Each of them.
John, we've seen two reports from Barak Ravid. He's a reporter for Axios, and
Yes.
he mentioned that behind the scene, the foreign minister of Iran is talking with Steve Witkoff. Right after tweeting that, we've seen Araghchi, the foreign minister of Iran, coming out saying it's a total lie.
Yes.
There is nothing happening, and they're trying to manipulate the market. They're trying to.
Yes.
How you understand the way that Donald Trump is trying to resolve his challenges?
Oh, well, look, first of all, the reporter you mentioned and the publication you mentioned, it isn't journalism, it's straight mouthpiece. And that particular journalist gets his scoops because he's fed them. It's classic mouthpiece propaganda, first. Second, there was a meeting between Kushner and Witkoff, and Putin's representative, President Putin, sent on order Kirill Dmitriev last Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, Wednesday, Thursday, to Miami to negotiate with Witkoff and Kushner, notwithstanding the consensus in the Security Council that never again can you trust anybody. This has been clearly said by ex-President Medvedev, the former president of Russia. Okay, there is an attempt to negotiate with Witkoff and Kushner, but it's Russian. I have no reason to disbelieve Foreign Minister Araghchi that there's been no negotiation between the Iranian side and those two. The factional politics in Russia are different. We'll come to that in a minute. To go back to your question, Iran has established itself in two extraordinary and unanticipated ways. First, it has found, and my whole lifetime career in politics has been about how do weak countries defend their sovereignty against powerful ones. And for the first time I've seen a sustained win at the Achilles heel strategy. That's what Iran has demonstrated it's capable of. It's found the Achilles heel of the empire, and it's become the gatekeeper of the Hormuz, the geography of the world's energy supply. Those two achievements, notwithstanding all of the damage that's been inflicted on them, those two things leave the Iranian side. One isn't proud, one doesn't boast, one doesn't puff up one's feathers. This is serious war and people die every minute. But from the Iranian side, they understand, because we understand. The Americans are confused now as to how to negotiate, because they have to negotiate on, let's call it the Moshtaba terms. We just mentioned them. and they can't be seen to be negotiating with the son of the man they just murdered. And Witkoff and Kushner have discredited themselves, absolutely. So how is it to be done? The Foreign Minister of India, Jaishankar, puts up his small hand, and he's a small man, and he's got to clean up the mess of his prime minister. He is proposing that India can act as a neutral. It isn't neutral, and everybody understands is India under Modi in the Knesset was not neutral. However, Jaishankar is trying to act as the intermediary here. We'll have to see whether the CIA can come up with a formula, but it can't be a Chabadnik like Kushner. Impossible. Impossible. It will have to be people possibly we don't know of who are credible for the representation of the US military and credible for the representation of CIA, the so-called deep state. I don't know who they are. There are a lot of people who put up their hand because they figure they can make money at it. People who boast about being intermediaries are trying to sell themselves. So it's got to be extremely quiet. It's got to be extremely quick. And it's very hard to see how it can be done, but it can be done. And I assume it must be done from a US point of view because they need to end their war within 2 to 3 more weeks. Does that answer your question?
I think, John, the bases, American bases in the Persian Gulf, Arab states are of particular importance for Iran because they cannot root out the CIA in these countries, but bases are something physical. Correct. You can say you cannot be there. And how do you see the way that these Arab states trying to communicate with Russia? And do you see that they're getting to that point that they don't need the United States to be there?
The monarchies need the United States. There's no doubt about that. The United States is the gatekeeper of their wealth, the guardian of their wealth. Their wealth is denominated in dollars, not in dinars, or dirhams, or any other form of Arab currency. It's an interesting question if one looks at it from a military and diplomatic and strategic point of view of Iran. Would Iran take the view now that a US base that has lost its radar capacity is no longer the threat to Iran that it was? And if the Zayed family, if the MBS family need the US presence for internal security, does Iran find that as threatening? I think not. Can the Arab states, remember that Takhnun bin Zayed signed an MOU for defense with Prime Minister Modi in January. Takhnun and his brother signed a defense agreement with India. Well, it's now useless, isn't it? It's within months, that particular pact is useless. MBS signed with the Pakistanis. Is that useless today? Yes, it is. These pieces of paper are useless. So I think the Arab states, and there's lots, these chaps do a lot of telephoning to Foreign Minister Lavrov, to President Putin and others, and the Russian side politely answers the telephone, doesn't initiate too many of these telephone calls anymore. They're called. So the answer really suggests, or the record suggests, the Arab states want the Russia to intermediate with Iran for some shortening of the war and an outcome that's less destructive for them. they are showing by their way they're telephoning that they too need intermediation with Iran because they lack it directly. Of course, they could talk directly with Foreign Minister Arakchi. They could, but they can't, not at the moment. Could they accept a situation where the United States walks away and de facto agrees with Iran not to rebuild the radar system? If that were agreed by the United States, guess what the Israelis will think? It leaves them defenseless. The AN radar plus the THAAD plus the Patriot system is the system that protects Israel, not the Iron Dome, not the David Sling, and not the other short-range systems they've got. Israel now has, as Ted Postel explained, a 30-second warning of incoming Iranian attack. Can Israel accept a US agreement that let's leave the bases? We've evacuated thousands of men. We will withdraw the Marines and the special forces threatening Hague Island. Yeah, okay. But if we don't rebuild the radars, won't that be acceptable? And in effect, if that were to happen, what it would mean would be the US is accepting that mutual assured destruction now exists between Israel and Iran. It's stable. Okay? Now, you don't send Ted Postel between Israel and Iran to negotiate that, though he clearly understands and explained to everybody how it works. But the Israelis, and certainly Netanyahu, can't accept that for the moment. I think the US could accept the, let's call it, non-operational status of the bases in the Middle East that would remain to protect the Arab monarchies, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Emirates, and Oman, and Jordan. It can accept that status, and Iran might accept that status and leave for the future the internal turmoil that will follow because the Arab monarchies have showed total incapability of resisting Iran. And that's for future, without an energy threat to the rest of the world. That's Middle Eastern politics. And it's a Middle Eastern politics in which Israel is weaker than it has ever been. Now, do you think I'm exaggerating here? I think the US can go on to go back in time to 45, 46, when Abdulaziz met with President Roosevelt in Bitter Lake, Egypt. And Roosevelt wanted to bribe Abdulaziz to take the Palestinians out of Palestine. Abdulaziz refused that. But Abdulaziz accepted the need to move to the Americans to protect the House of Saud against all the other claimants for Saudi Arabia's control and the control of oil. And I think we're heading back to a 1946 situation in which Iran might agree tacitly. I don't know how one would negotiate that, but the Americans have got to come up with somebody within 2 weeks. Isn't that fun to watch?
Yeah. John, Donald Trump shows some sort of signs that he may deliberately ignoring the facts on the battlefield, or he tries to picture the situation. I don't know the level and the quality of information that he's receiving, because he's talking about all these people on streets in Iran, they're fake and they're AI, and it's unbelievable
Yes.
what he's talking about. And
Yes.
on the battlefield, he says that everything was destroyed. Navy was destroyed, army is destroyed, Air Force is destroyed, 90% of their missiles were destroyed. And here is what he said about Iran after all.
Maybe they don't want to be targeted, but I say, wouldn't matter if you're targeted or not, because this is a paper tiger that we're dealing with now. It wasn't a paper tiger 2 weeks ago. It's a paper tiger now. So
we have the case of Ukraine. For 4 years, we have a real war happening between Ukraine and Russia. I have never heard, Putin coming out and saying that Ukraine is a paper tiger.
No,
And
that's
Donald
right.
Trump, after 2 weeks, comes out and says Iran is a paper tiger while he's begging other countries to help him in the Strait of Hormuz. Why is that? Is that Donald Trump? Is that the system? What is your understanding of that?
Well, look, I've got a PhD in politics. I don't have a PhD in psychopathology, nor a PhD in understanding the symptoms of a liar, a chronic liar. In this particular case, it's not unusual for the President of the United States losing a war to exaggerate the winning streak. I don't think Trump is anything unusual in that. He has obviously obsessions about the success of violence. He's a violent man. He's probably personally and psychopathologically the most violent individual ever to sit in the White House as President of the United States. In the outcome of this war, there's one thing, an individual with that sort of psychopathology, exceptionalist, racist, racial supremacist, as he shares with his MAGA constituency, there's one thing they can't understand. They can't understand that the weak can stand up to the strong and hit the Achilles heel that brings the big man down. The Achilles heel brings the big man down. They can't understand that. They do understand psychologically that weakness is to be exploited. And we've had thousands of years of understanding that the strong do what they can, the weak what they must, to misquote Thucydides. Trump only understands force and will, in fact, retreat when the force balance moves against him. That he, at this point, has to, there's a lag between the failure of the first week and the failure of the failure of the first week we just go through. He says, he and Hegseth and General Kane and the others say they knocked out all of the Navy. They knocked out all of the Air Force, as you just recited. However, they're not counting the fact that Iran wasn't fighting with the forces they've knocked out. They've knocked out power that wasn't being used to effect the kind of resistance, the kind of war that Iran was waging, and that war survived, that capacity survived. So they succeeded in destroying what didn't materially affect the balance of power. They knocked out a target that wasn't useful, was a ploy, a decoy, and that's masking the failure of the first week. Decapitation failed, destruction of missile retaliation failed, and the Iranians retained the control of energy supply for the world. That's the second week of failure. Hormuz closes, and no, as you said, no NATO, no US fleet dares to come in, not because there are mines there. Iran doesn't need to mine. No one needs to mine the straits. The mining of the straits would adversely affect the speed of recovery for Iran, first of all. No, it's drones. It's drone attacks. And the US has simply failed at doing that. So the second week was the failure to keep control of the Hormuz. we're into the third week, and the question then becomes, what will be the failure of the war aims, and how will the US, Trump, Kane, Hegseth dress up what will remain the strategic problem we've just explained? I don't find it at all surprising that Trump needs to talk this up. He thinks, and his political technicians in the White House tell him, look, boss, you've got your base, your voter base thinks you're winning. Your voter base thinks, has greater level of approval for what you're doing in Iran than it thinks in terms of approval for almost anything else you're doing. So there's a negative disapproval gap of, let's say, 3.5 percentage points on Iran, whereas there is a 25 to 26 point negative approval rating for inflation. So the technicians, the political technicians, tell Trump, maximize, broadcast, exaggerate, win, win, win on the military, because you're getting to the voters we need there. Those voters will disappear with inflation, with the gas pump price. They will disappear. And that's going to come within the next 2 weeks. That's what they're afraid of. So I think we will see Trump shift. He will shift to the problem of inflation. He will shift to the problem of domestic. He has to demonstrate he can win, win, win on the domestic front, and he can't as prices go out of control. He can't. What he can demonstrate for muscle flexing is his attitude to Cuba. He can say that I'm going to my siege of Cuba is succeeding. I've very cleverly diverted the Russian attention. I've diverted Iranian attention. I've diverted Mexican attention. Cuba is starving for oil and oil products. Russia can't save them. Russia won't save them. I would say that we will see shortly Trump shifting to American region-centered violence and claim victory there. But he will have to shift on the one thing his political technicians tell him. You must capture oil price now, boss. And if the message from the markets, from New York, from the major banks, is you must not let this war go on because the markets are suffering, credit is suffering, the economy is. Those messages pour in. Trump may not pay much attention, but when translated into political terms, poll terms, he will have to change his line. He can't change the way he talks. As I said at the beginning, there's a direct correlation between votes and tweets. So you interpret his tweets and these short sentences, slogans, and jingles he recites over and over. You've got to see them as pitches at votes. When the votes abandon him on inflation, he will change his tune. He must.
John, the other player, you've mentioned India, the other player is Pakistan. And
yes,
how did you find Pakistan so far? We had the foreign minister of Iran, if I'm not mistaken, on yesterday, tweeting in Urdu, not in English, not in Persian, in Urdu, thanking and in the government in Pakistan. How do you see the role of Pakistan in the whole calculation that you've just mentioned?
Better I ask you how you see the Iranian position of Pakistan, but putting it, answering your question first, and then you answer your question. Pakistan is a strategic danger to Iran if it becomes, as it has been in the past, not simply a military dictatorship. That's almost a constant in Pakistan's unfortunate history, unfortunate for the Pakistani people. To the extent that it's a military dictatorship, it is always at war with India and always beholden to the United States. Its brief alliance with China is more or less over. And the war of last April, May ended the capacity of the Chinese to influence the Pakistanis effectively. So if Pakistan is always an active American platform, Iran always has to be concerned with the possibility of US special operations using helicopters on Pakistani territory to fly into the east of Iran. I understand from some sources that that's happened. It's been denied. If Mr. Arakchi is courting Pakistan, he's trying to say, don't put all your eggs in an American basket. You were already disappointed by putting some of your eggs in the Chinese basket, and it didn't work very well during last year's Kashmir war. So I see an attempt by Iran to achieve a neutral position from Pakistan, as neutral as the Pakistanis can be in their circumstances of considerable dependency on the US and on Saudi Arabia for cash. So from Iranian point of view, I would be courting both the Pakistanis and the Indians right now and hope that they, as it were, don't lock again into warfare that damages both of them. But leaving that aside, I would say Arakchi's approach now is a balanced one. It's a reasonable one for a neighbor. It's a historical, cultural affinity. Since Darius, the 2,500 years ago, and his son Xerxes were both rulers of what's called Pakistan today, all the way up to the Indus and into the Punjab and into the Sindh. Persia has been a very important force culturally. I'm not telling you, I'm speaking a bit for our audience. You understand that. Therefore, I think the Iranian position has to be a very balanced one in the courteous, cultured way that Arakchi can perform towards both Pakistan and India. And if that requires speaking in Urdu or speaking in Hindi, Mr. Arakchi can manage both of those. Yes, he will. But the big but is, the fact of the matter is, the US is walking away or will walk away from this conflict, thinking they've drawn India closer than they were before this conflict, and they maintain their position, Trump's position, with Asif Munir, the ruler of Pakistan, that they had before the war. Saudi Arabia is always going to be a source of cash for its own self, for the protection of the ruling family. No, I don't see that speaking in Urdu politely to Islamabad makes a significant change in the strategy. The significant change in the strategies coming from the Hormuz.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you, Nima. Let's see if the war of 2 weeks away will be the same next week. And let's see if, the way we began, Prime Minister Netanyahu can demonstrate more than lifting a cup of coffee or talking to a pair of girls, whether there has been or is underway a military putsch in Israel that will remove him from command. Those are the two big takeaways for today. And let's see if we're wrong, if we're right in a week's time.
Yeah, exactly.